Hello, how are you doing today? I hope you're having a wonderful day. Now, I'm sure it's passed through your mind considering having a tiny home. And so we're tackling the topic about the laws of where you can put those tiny homes. Now, I know what you're thinking, laws, boring. But trust me, understanding these regulations is the difference between having your tiny home dream or having it towed away because you're not complying. So we're going to break down everything you need to know so you can have confident navigation of the legal landscape of tiny living laws. So let's dive in. All right, so why all the fuss about a tiny home? Whether it's on wheels or it's a cute little cabin, the truth is local governments often don't have separate zoning ordinances or building codes designed for tiny homes. They're usually self-traditional, conventional homes that are stick-built, meaning they put a foundation down, you put the framing up, you put the siding up, you put the drywall up. It's built on site, every piece of it. So this creates a lot of gray areas and frankly, a lot of headache for us tiny home hopefuls. We're talking about things like minimum square footage requirements, foundation rules, and even how many dwellings can be on a property. That means you can have the primary residence, maybe a shed, maybe a garage, so you have to think about all of those details. So it is a patchwork quilt of regulation, and understanding where your specific area stands is crucial. So that's oftentimes when you tell me that you're interested in a tiny home or you want to place a tiny home somewhere and you call about land that's for sale and you ask about that, usually my first words are out of my mouth are going to be, what's a tiny home to you? Because the minimum square footage is going to be, in our area, the biggest obstacle. It depends on the bill of assurance for the subdivision that you're building your home in or the land that you're buying that you want to put the home on. In Cherokee Village, for example, they're all the way down to 600, but up to 1,200, and that's a minimum. So in the 600, a lot of people would call that a tiny home and make that work for them, but the 1,200, probably not so much. So that square footage is definitely going to be an important part. The foundation probably isn't going to be a big deal. You can put it on blocks, you can put it on a slab, so that's not so much a deal. But the dwelling units is important because I know in Cherokee Village you can have your primary dwelling and you can have one secondary dwelling. So it depends on if this tiny home is going to be a second one or it's going to be a primary one, so how that plays out depending on where you want to put your tiny home. Now let's talk about zoning, because this is often where the biggest roadblocks appear. Zoning ordinance dictate how land can be used. Residential, commercial, agricultural, you get the idea. So many areas have the minimum square footage, the requirement for residential homes, which can instantly disqualify a tiny house. Then there's the question of whether your tiny home is considered a primary dwelling or accessory dwelling, or even an RV if you've got this tiny home on wheels. So each designation comes with its own set of rules. For example, some places might allow the ADU, which is an accessory dwelling unit on a property, but only if they're smaller than the main house. So again, we come into the square footage. And you're not renting it out independently. So like you live in the tiny home in the backyard and you rent out your main house. There's going to be rules about that in certain cities. So it's a lot to untangle, but don't worry, we're going to try to simplify it for you. My main point is that you need to be calling the planning and zoning of whatever town that you're going to plan to have that tiny home in, because more than likely they're going to be different than every town around or even every state around where you're looking. So you want to make sure that you get the details because every person has a different idea of what they plan to do. Maybe you just want to have that tiny home, that's it. Maybe you want to have a big house and a little house. Maybe you want to put your mother-in-law in the tiny house and you live in the main house, or the opposite. Maybe you want the tiny house and she wants the big house, or your kids. So you have to be, is it just really specific to each person on what you wanted to do? So that's why often I have to ask for more details. As far as an RV or anything on wheels, most of the time in our area, that's going to be considered a mobile home, and you're not going to be able to put that on a lot except where mobile homes are allowed. For example, in Cherokee Village, there's only one subdivision. The Santa Fe subdivision is the only place you can put a mobile home. In Horseshoe Bend, there's a couple subdivisions that you can put them in. So you really got to look at those bills of assurance, and of course also check with the planning and zoning office to see what the ordinances are and what you can put where. Now on to building codes. So we talked about bills of assurance and ordinances. Those are mainly for the whole town. The ordinances are. The bills of assurance are for each subdivision, and then building codes are more about safety, structural integrity, making sure the home is habitable, that somebody can actually live in it and it's not just a shed. But here's The problem is that traditional building codes are designed for traditional homes, conventional homes. You're talking about ceiling heights because of fire, window size so you can get out of it if there's a fire. Still talking about fire. And plumbing requirements because you have to have heat and air and water and electric. So a lot of tiny homes, especially those one on wheels, might not meet these actual standards because they are smaller and you can't fit all that stuff into one little building. So there are certificates that you can get depending on the state that you're in for those tiny homes if they're on wheels, depending on the building codes. You know, some of them you're going to have because of those safety issues. So knowing which codes apply to you and where you're building is essential for a smooth process. As far as I know, the building codes are going to be the same no matter what size. If you're planning on living in it, it's going to have those fire safety standards. And if you're putting a building on a property and it's going to be your primary residence, you're going to have water. You're going to have some sort of sewer, whether it's septic or an actual sewer system, because oftentimes when you set a water or electric meter, they require that you at least have the plans in place to put the septic system in. So, and if you go to larger land, then that might be different because once you get over 10 acres, it's not necessarily required that you have an exact septic system in Arkansas. So you just need to look into all those details, not just about if the house is allowed, but also the utilities that are going to be available where you want to put your tiny home. So that first kind of lump is finding land that is zoned correctly for the tiny home that you want to build and the building codes, but you still might run into maybe a homeowners association or specific property covenants. Covenants are often put into the deed so they can't be changed, where an HOA is like a separate association from the land. So these are private agreements that can be placed on an additional restriction on what you can build or place on the land. I've often seen this even on rural land that's larger acreage. The deed actually has restrictions on if you can put a mobile home on there, or it has to have a pitched roof, because often mobile or manufactured homes have flat roofs. So they want you to have a pitched roof so it's not a mobile home, to keep the value of the neighborhood up. So I've heard plenty of stories about people finding the perfect lot only to discover that there's HOA rules prohibiting anything under that certain square footage, or even dictating the exterior appearance of the homes. Like if you wanted to use a building, the trailers on a truck or the train buildings, I can't think of the word right now, but lots of people are wanting to use those for buildings, and you can use them in many areas, but then you have to paint them so they don't have the company name on the side. So they can determine that exterior appearance, like if it's metal or it has to be wood siding, things like that. So make sure you always check for these before you commit to a property, because you want to make sure that you can actually do what you plan to do with the property. You don't want to buy the land only to find out that you can't put your dream home on it. It can be really frustrating, and often I've seen that with people around here. They don't necessarily work with a realtor. They don't necessarily, the person that's selling the property, if they do it for sale by owner, the person doesn't necessarily know those restrictions. So they think they're buying some land that they can come and put the house on that they really want to put on there, and then they get here and they're like, you can't do any of that. So you need to do your research as a buyer. That is your due diligence. It's great if you have someone to advise you, like your realtor that's helping you with the negotiations and the purchase of the home. But if you decide to do it on your own, or even sometimes with the realtor, because they're not going to know necessarily all the details about that property, nor are they going to know what you want to do. So it's very important that you do your due diligence. I know this sounds like a lot. There's a lot of details that goes into this, maybe a little bit more than just purchasing a home, but you are building a home, so there are more details to get into. But the good news is there are often loopholes or alternative solutions that tiny home owners are successfully using. You can try to find things like land in rural areas, and we are definitely a rural area, but you have to be careful because we still have restrictions, some of the things that I've already talked about. You could also consider using RV parks or mobile home parks if you do have a tiny home on wheels. And there's also tiny home communities that are specifically designed to navigate these legalities. So you could find a couple of lots and just build on a whole cul-de-sac and have a bunch of tiny homes there, and that might qualify you to comply with the zoning restrictions. So you just have to be a little more flexible with your plans. But some people even go the route of purchasing land and using their tiny homes as the ADU, the alternative dwelling unit, or getting creative with a guest house or a caretaker's cottage designation. So you want to make sure that you do read through the details so you can kind of tweak what you want to do to be in compliance. It might take a little bit of research and creativity, but it's definitely possible. So that's why it's important, I believe, to actually make sure that you're following the rules if you can. You can also go with, there's the permission or forgiveness. So you can go for forgiveness and just say that you think you're doing the right thing, and then if they come along and say, no, that's not okay, then you're gonna have to go back and fix it. But most often, fixing it later is gonna be more expensive than getting permission up front. So again, that's why I say that it's best to ask questions so you can make sure that you're doing what you're able to, and then you don't have to worry about somebody catching you later. So you're probably wondering, how do I even start researching all this? Well, my top advice is definitely start with your local planning or zoning department. Their websites often have all their ordinances available, and a quick phone call can clear up a lot of confusion. Angela at the Cherokee Village Planning and Zoning Office is really great. She can probably answer your questions without even looking it up. So don't be afraid to call and ask direct questions about things like minimum square footage, the alternative dwelling unit, and whether a tiny house on wheels is considered a dwelling. Now, I know on CherokeeVillage.org, you can go, they have the ordinances that they passed, they have all the bills of assurance, so you can look at specific subdivisions and see which one has that 600 square foot minimum, and also the plats, so you can see how big the lots are that you're wanting to build on. So if you're seriously thinking of building a tiny home and you want to go towards your future, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. If you haven't already, we've got so much more home goodness in North Central Arkansas coming your way, and you don't want to miss out. Despite all these challenges that we just went through, the future of tiny home laws is looking brighter. More and more cities and even states are recognizing the demand for affordable and sustainable housing and starting to adapt their regulations. We're seeing new tiny home specific zoning ordinances, and that makes the permitting process more streamlined, and even state level legislation supporting tiny home living. So with this moment, as more and more people are desire it, more and more people are going to accept it, and more governments are going to make the changes. It might be slow because we know the red tape can be difficult, but it's an exciting time to be part of this community. So don't give up your tiny home goals if you see that it's right for you in your future. All right, tiny home seekers, we covered a lot of ground today. From understanding zoning and building codes to finding clever solutions, you're now armed with the knowledge you need to confidently approach tiny home laws. Remember, a little bit of research and persistence goes a long way in making your tiny home dreams a reality. So don't let those legals scare you away. With the right information, you can absolutely find your perfect slice of tiny heaven. So if you found this information helpful, make sure you check out this video I did about the whole home buying process, whether you're buying a home or land. Thanks for watching and have a blessed day.